Growing up, I always knew my place in the family hierarchy, second to my sister Emma, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. It didn't matter what I achieved or how hard I worked. My accomplishments were always overshadowed, dismissed, or ignored entirely. At 28, with a thriving career as a senior software engineer, I should have felt secure in my success. But every interaction with my parents was a reminder that nothing I did would ever be enough. They measured worth in beauty, charm, and the ability to maintain an illusion of perfection, qualities Emma mastered effortlessly. I, on the other hand, was practical, hardworking, and independent, traits they saw as secondary at best, undesirable at worst. That reality was never clearer than during our weekly family dinners, a ritual that felt more like an endurance test than a gathering of loved ones. That night was no different. I had barely finished sharing the news of my latest promotion, a major project lead at Silicon Tech, when my mother's voice cut through my excitement, completely ignoring my announcement. "Emily, why can't you dress more like your sister? She always looks so put together." The words were like a reflex, automatic, as if any conversation about me had to be redirected toward Emma's superiority. I forced myself to take a deep breath, my grip tightening around my fork. "Mom, I'm leading a security overhaul that could change the way our company handles data protection." My voice was steady, controlled, but I already knew it wouldn't matter. She waved a dismissive hand, barely listening. "That's nice, dear," she said, but her voice lacked any real interest. Then, with a sudden spark of enthusiasm, she turned toward my father. "Did you hear? Emma's boyfriend, James, is taking her to Paris next month. Isn't that wonderful?" Across the table, my best friend Ava, who I had invited for moral support, met my eyes. She didn't need to say anything. Her expression said it all. This was the kind of nonsense she had witnessed time and time again. Always Emma. Always their perfect daughter. "Actually, Mrs. Jackson," Ava interjected, her voice polite but firm, "Emily's project could revolutionize Silicon Tech's entire security framework. It's a huge deal." For a moment, I let myself feel a flicker of gratitude. Ava had always been in my corner, the one person who never let me fade into the background. But before my mother could acknowledge her, my father spoke up, effortlessly steering the conversation back where it always landed. "Speaking of security," he said, his voice rich with authority, "Emma and James are looking at houses in the Heritage District. Now that's a secure investment." The implication was clear. Emma was making real moves in life. My work, my career, my achievements, they were just passing hobbies in their eyes. I stared at my plate, pushing my food around, swallowing the sharp sting of frustration. My mind drifted back to years of being sidelined. The student loans I had worked 3 jobs to pay off while Emma's tuition was covered without question. The family vacations I wasn't invited to because Emma needed quality time with our parents. And now, as if to drive the point home, my mother gushed, "Have you seen Emma's engagement ring?" She shoved her phone toward Ava, practically beaming. "James proposed last weekend. $20,000. Can you believe it?" Ava, to her credit, kept her composure. "How nice," she said flatly, squeezing my hand under the table in silent reassurance. I swallowed back the bitterness rising in my throat. Later that night, as I sat in my apartment, my phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Mom says you seem jealous at dinner. Don't worry, you can be a bridesmaid if you stick to the diet plan I make for you." My stomach twisted. It wasn't just the message itself. It was the casual cruelty, the way she wielded words like tiny gleaming daggers, knowing exactly where to aim. I exhaled sharply, tossing my phone onto the couch. "You don't have to respond to that," Ava said from beside me, her tone firm. She had kicked off her heels and was nursing a glass of wine, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. "She's a piece of work." I forced a smile, trying to shake off the weight of the evening. "Did I tell you what happened at work today?" I said instead. "Diana, my mentor, told me I'm being considered for the executive track." Ava's face lit up. "That's amazing," she said, leaning forward. For the first time that night, warmth replaced the chill in my chest. "See? You're crushing it on your own terms." My phone buzzed again. Another message from Emma. "James's family is coming to dinner tomorrow. Try not to embarrass me by talking about your computer stuff." The words hit harder than I wanted them to. I set the phone down with more force than necessary. "You know what the worst part is?" I murmured, looking at Ava. "I keep trying. I keep thinking that if I just achieve enough, they'll finally see me." Ava's gaze softened. "I see you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And trust me, your sister's perfect life isn't as perfect as she pretends." I had no idea then just how right she was, or how much everything was about to implode. The wedding preparations were just beginning, setting off a chain of events that would expose every lie my family had built Emma's golden pedestal on. A few weeks later, the big day arrived, and I found myself sitting in the back row of Emma's wedding reception. Yes, you heard that right. The back row. Not in the bridal party, not in a family section, but tucked away like some distant acquaintance. Ava adjusted her dress beside me, her mouth set in a tight line. "Can you believe she sat you back here?" she whispered. I could. I watched Emma twirl in her designer gown, our parents beaming beside her. Everything was going exactly as expected, until a server placed a fancy envelope next to my plate. Thinking it was part of the wedding favors, I opened it and froze. A bill. $200 for my plate, along with a handwritten note. "We expect payment before you leave." My hands tightened around the paper. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked, my voice low. Ava snatched the note from my hand, her face turning crimson. "Oh, hell no," she muttered, pulling out her phone and discreetly recording. Before I could process it, my mother approached, her syrupy tone as fake as the smile on her face. "Emily, dear," she cooed, "did you get the envelope?" My pulse pounded. "Are you seriously charging me to attend my own sister's wedding?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Well, sweetie," she said smoothly, "Emma thought it was only fair since you didn't contribute to the wedding expenses." Unlike James's family, who've been so generous. My stomach turned. From across the room, I caught James's gaze. He looked uncomfortable, hesitant. My voice was tight as I replied, "I offered to help with planning, decorations, everything. Emma told me she didn't want my help because I'd embarrass her." My mother sniffed dismissively. "Well, you would have, dear. Now, will that be cash or check?" Emma sauntered over then, her gown trailing behind her like a trophy. "Oh, good, you got the bill," she said, her smirk sharp as a blade. "Just trying to teach my little sister about financial responsibility." I stared at her, disbelief mingling with something sharper, something dangerously close to fury. "Financial responsibility?" I repeated. "I'm a senior software engineer. I make 6 figures. Emma's smirk didn't falter. "Then paying shouldn't be a problem." I reached for my checkbook, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the realization that this, right here, was the last straw. I sat there, fingers curling around the checkbook, the weight of 1,000 small betrayals pressing down on me. The laughter and clinking glasses of the wedding reception blurred into background noise, a distant hum of celebration that felt entirely separate from the cold reality in front of me. My mother standing tall and expectant, Emma smug in her pristine designer gown, and my father watching from a distance with that same quiet indifference he always carried when it came to my struggles. I could have paid the bill. It would have been easy, an insignificant dent in my bank account, but it was never about the money. It was about what that bill represented, about years of being treated as less, about the casual cruelty disguised as tradition, about the way Emma had taken and taken and taken while I had spent my whole life trying to earn a seat at a table that was never meant for me. My breath came slowly, measured, as I met Emma's gaze, searching for even the smallest flicker of doubt in her expression. But there was nothing, just smug certainty. She thought she had won. Ava's voice cut through the tension, her anger barely restrained. "You've got to be kidding me," she hissed, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass. "Charging your own sister to attend your wedding? What's next? Billing your guests for the air they breathe?" Her words had bite, and for the first time I saw a ripple of discomfort pass through the nearby guests. Heads turned subtly in our direction, murmurs stirring in the air like the first hint of a coming storm. Emma's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, straightening her shoulders. "It's only fair," she said smoothly, casting a calculated glance at the people now watching. "James's family contributed so much. It's only right that everyone pulls their weight." But even as she spoke, I could hear it. The small, nearly imperceptible tremor in her voice. She could feel the shift, the subtle but undeniable realization that she might have pushed too far this time. I let the silence stretch, let her squirm just a little longer before I finally moved. But instead of reaching for my wallet, I picked up the bill, folded it neatly and placed it back on the table. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, I stood, adjusting the hem of my dress as I looked down at Emma, whose expression had begun to slip from confidence into something more uncertain. "No," I said simply. One word, but it carried the weight of every moment I had spent trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. Emma blinked, as if she hadn't quite processed it. "What?" "No," I repeated, my voice steady, even. "I'm not paying." I turned to my mother, who looked scandalized, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't quite believe I had the audacity to refuse. "You want me to contribute to this wedding? Fine. My contribution is my presence. And since that's clearly not enough for you, I'll take it back." With that, I turned on my heel, my pulse roaring in my ears as I stepped away from the table. Ava was beside me in an instant, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she matched my stride. Behind us, I could hear the sudden rise of voices, Emma sputtering something about ungratefulness, my mother's sharp reprimand, my father's familiar silence. But none of it mattered anymore. The night air hit me like a breath of clarity as we stepped outside, the cool breeze cutting through the heated flush of adrenaline in my veins. Ava exhaled a laugh, incredulous and full of something like pride. "That," she said, shaking her head, "was long overdue." I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight that had been pressing down on me for years start to lift, piece by piece. "Yeah," I murmured, glancing back at the grand venue, at the glowing windows where shadows moved behind the curtains. A world I had spent my whole life trying to belong to, but one that had never truly belonged to me. It was. The fallout was swift and dramatic. By the time I got home that night, my phone was flooded with messages. My mother's texts were a mix of anger and carefully crafted guilt trips. "You embarrassed the family. How could you be so selfish?" My father, unsurprisingly, said nothing, but it was Emma's message that stood out the most. "You'll regret this. You think you're better than us, but you'll always be the outsider." I stared at the screen, feeling an odd sense of calm settle over me. Maybe she was right. Maybe I would always be the outsider in this family. But for the first time, that realization didn't feel like a loss. It felt like freedom. Days passed, then weeks, and something strange happened. I stopped waiting for their approval. I threw myself into my work, accepting the executive track promotion without hesitation. I went on spontaneous weekend trips with Ava, filling my time with laughter and experiences that didn't revolve around trying to prove myself. And most importantly, I stopped answering my family's calls. It wasn't easy. Years of conditioning didn't disappear overnight. But every time I felt the old guilt creeping in, I reminded myself of that wedding night, of the bill on the table, of Emma's smirk. I reminded myself that walking away wasn't just about that moment. It was about reclaiming every part of myself they had tried to diminish. Then, one afternoon, I got an unexpected call from James. Hesitant, uncertain. "Can we meet?" he asked. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won. When we met at a quiet cafe, he looked different. Less polished, more strained. "Emma and I are divorcing," he said without preamble. I blinked, caught off guard. "It's only been 6 months." He let out a humorless laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, well, turns out she's not who I thought she was." I didn't say anything, waiting. He exhaled sharply. "I should have seen it. The way she treated you, the way your family enabled her. I thought it was just sibling rivalry, but..." He shook his head. "It wasn't. It was a pattern. And I was just another person she needed to control." A strange mix of emotions churned in my chest. I should have felt vindicated, triumphant even. But all I felt was a deep, settling confirmation of what I had always known. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it, not because I regretted what happened, but because I understood the weight of waking up to the truth too late. As I left the cafe that day, I realized something profound. Emma's world was crumbling, not because of me, but because it had never been built on anything real. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't standing in her shadow. I was standing on my own, in my own light, and it was enough. More than enough.